One sweltering summer afternoon a few months back, a simple channel change by my dad while mom was out irrevocably altered our relationship, leading to some of the most significant moments of my life. The only sound in the living room was the faint drone of the AC unit struggling against the oppressive heat. Sunlight streamed through the partially drawn blinds, painting stripes of gold across the room. I lay sprawled on the couch, aimlessly surfing channels, consumed by the peculiar brand of boredom that only long summer days can evoke. My dad, Robert, sat nearby in his recliner, silently scrolling through his phone. Mom was out with friends, shopping, and wouldn't be home for dinner until 6 p.m. With college looming, I felt adrift in that awkward space between adolescence and adulthood, unsure of my place. My relationship with Dad had always been adequate. He was a good man, quiet, reserved, and practical, but we lacked the closeness I occasionally yearned for. He wasn't one to discuss feelings, and I was a son burdened with emotions I couldn't articulate. Dad's voice, low and rumbling, broke the silence. "Nothing good on?" "Nope," I muttered, continuing to click through endless reruns and reality TV. "It's all junk." He chuckled dryly, placing his phone on the end table. "Want to watch a movie? Maybe something new?" I glanced at him, surprised. Dad wasn't usually one to initiate these things. "Yeah, sure," I shrugged. "What do you want to watch?" He rose and stretched, walking over to the TV stand where the streaming remote lay. "Let's see what's available. Something different." As he browsed the options, I sank deeper into the couch. The sunlight outside had softened, and the room felt cooler, more intimate. After scrolling past countless action films, he paused on a thumbnail I didn't recognize. A dark image with a somber title and small, understated text. "What's that?" I asked, straightening up slightly. He clicked it without responding, and the screen faded to black before the opening credits began to roll. It was something I'd never seen before. The narrator's voice was deep and hushed, accompanied by fleeting images of city streets and lonely faces. Within minutes, I realized it was one of those intimate documentaries, the kind that delved into hidden lives, secrets, and desires most people were too afraid to acknowledge. I shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of a growing tension in the room. Dad remained silent as the documentary played, his eyes fixed on the screen with an unusual intensity. I tried to appear nonchalant, stealing glances at him, but there was no mistaking it. He wasn't just passively watching, he was completely absorbed. The first story featured a man who had spent years concealing his true self from his family. The footage was raw and emotionally charged, and I felt a tightness in my chest as I watched. I typically avoided this kind of content. It felt too real, too close to feelings I preferred to suppress. But sitting there with Dad, it was impossible to ignore. When the first story ended and the screen cut to black, I cleared my throat. Then something even more explicit came on. Adult content you had to pay for, between two men. Dad, this is kind of weird. Are you sure you want to keep watching this?" He looked at me, his face calm but unreadable. "Yeah, it's fine. Interesting, don't you think?" I guess," I stammered, my voice trailing off as the next story began, even more personal than the last. My stomach churned and heat rose in my neck. It wasn't just the subject matter, it was the fact that I was watching it with him, my dad, of all people. The silence between us was almost unbearable. I glanced at him again, searching for any indication that he was also uncomfortable, but he just sat there, his gaze unwavering. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Dad?" I said, forcing a laugh to break the tension. "Why are we watching this? Mom's going to be back soon." He didn't respond immediately. For a moment, I thought he would ignore me completely. But then he turned his head slightly, his expression softer than I anticipated. "Why does it bother you so much?" I froze. "It doesn't." "It does," he said quietly, cutting me off. "I can see it." I felt like I was burning up. It's awkward, okay? Watching this kind of thing with you." "Why?" he pressed, his voice still calm but insistent. "What about it makes you uncomfortable?" I opened my mouth to answer but couldn't find the words. My throat tightened, my pulse pounding in my ears. Why was he asking me this? Why now? "Forget it," I mumbled, looking away. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," Dad said, his voice low. "Jake, you can talk to me." The documentary continued to play in the background, but I wasn't watching anymore. I stared at my hands, my heart racing as 100 thoughts flashed through my mind. I wanted to tell him the truth, that it bothered me because I saw too much of myself in the people on the screen, that I had spent years burying feelings I didn't understand, afraid of what they meant. But saying it out loud, that was something else entirely. Dad, I whispered, my voice barely audible, have you ever felt different? The question hung between us like a weight. I didn't dare look up at him, terrified of what I might see. The silence stretched on so long that I thought he wouldn't answer. But then, softly, he spoke. Yeah, he said, his voice steady. I have. My head snapped up, my eyes wide. You have? He nodded slowly, his eyes glued to the screen, yet his expression distant, as if lost in a memory. When I was younger, it was so much harder to grasp. Back then, nobody discussed these things. You just internalized it. I watched him, a tightness in my chest. What did you do? I asked. He sighed, raking a hand through his hair. I tried to dismiss it, pretend it wasn't real. But that never works, Jake. You can't hide from who you are indefinitely. His words landed like a gut punch. I'd spent so long doing precisely that. Hiding, feigning, burying everything so deep I hoped it would vanish. But it hadn't. It lingered, and hearing my dad acknowledge it aloud made it all the more tangible. Jake, he said, his voice gentler now. You don't have to bear this burden alone, not with me. I swallowed, my eyes stinging. What if I don't know who I am? That's all right, Dad said, turning to face me. You'll discover it. And when you do, I'll be here, no matter what. I was silent for a beat. What's strange? I asked, leaning back in his recliner, my tone cautious but firm, as if I wouldn't allow him to evade my question. I avoided his gaze, my eyes flitting back to the screen where another narrative unfolded, another man recounting years spent concealing himself, fearful of judgment. The camera cut to him standing solitary, gazing at the horizon, wind whipping through his hair. It was beautiful in a desolate way, and it made my stomach churn. This, I mumbled, gesturing vaguely at the TV. Watching this with you. Dad remained silent for a moment, and I could feel his gaze on me. I hated the vulnerability, like every unspoken thought I'd suppressed was rising to the surface. I wanted to bolt, but my legs were led. You know, Dad finally said, his voice low. I don't believe there's anything wrong with it. I swallowed, my throat constricting. With what? With any of this? What they're talking about? I stared at the screen, unseeing. My hands fidgeted, picking at a loose thread on my shorts. You don't think it's weird? No, Dad said simply. I think it's human. The words washed over me and my throat tightened. My chest ached, as if everything I'd contained was pressing against my ribs, desperate for release. I couldn't speak, so I just sat there, my heart pounding. After a moment, Dad sighed, leaning forward to touch me. Jake, you don't have to talk to me if you don't want to, but I'm here, and I want you to know that whatever you're feeling, whatever you're afraid of, it's okay. I bit my lip, my vision blurring. Why are you saying this? I whispered, my voice trembling. Because I can see how much it's consuming you, he replied, and I don't want you to feel like you have to endure it alone. I blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. My chest was tight, like I couldn't draw a full breath. I'd spent years masking, pretending everything was normal, that I was normal. But sitting here, hearing him say these things, it felt like a door had cracked open, and I was unsure whether I wanted to step through or slam it shut. I began, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to say it. Dad didn't pressure me, he just nodded, as if he understood. Take your time. I stared down at my lap, my hands shaking. The words were there, just out of reach. I could feel them welling up, and it was like if I didn't voice them now, I never would. I think... My voice faltered, and I forced myself to continue. I think I'm different. The room fell silent. I couldn't look at him, but I could feel his presence, steady, unwavering. I waited for him to speak, to say anything, but the silence stretched. I felt like I was unraveling. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice soft. What do you mean by different, Jake? I squeezed my eyes shut, my pulse throbbing in my ears. I don't know, I said, barely audible. I look at guys sometimes the way other people look at girls, and I don't know what that means, but I'm scared. It was out. The words I'd been too terrified to utter for years were finally in the open, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. My chest heaved, my hands trembled, as I waited for his reaction. I was terrified to look at him, to see the disappointment or confusion or whatever else I'd envisioned 1,000 times. But then I felt his hand on my shoulder, warm and firm. "Hey," he said softly, his voice steady. "It's okay, Jake." I opened my eyes, my vision blurred with tears. "It's not okay," I choked out. "What if there's something wrong with me?" "There's nothing wrong with you," Dad said, his tone firm but gentle. "Nothing at all." I looked at him then, and the expression on his face nearly undid me. He didn't look disappointed or angry or ashamed. He just looked there, solid and unwavering, like he was trying to hold me up with nothing but his words. "You're my son," he said quietly, his hand still on my shoulder. "And I love you. Nothing's ever going to change that." I felt the tears spill over then, hot and unstoppable. I tried to turn away to hide my face, but Dad pulled me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me tightly. I sobbed into his shoulder, all the years of fear and confusion pouring out of me. I couldn't hold back anymore. "It's okay," Dad whispered, his hand rubbing soothing circles on my back. "You don't have to be scared anymore." I don't know how long we stayed like that, me crying, Dad holding me without letting go. The world outside felt like it had vanished, leaving just the two of us in the dim living room. I'd spent so long convincing myself I couldn't confide in anyone, that nobody would understand. But Dad had proven me wrong. He was still here, steadfast. Eventually my tears subsided, and I pulled back, wiping my face with the back of my hand. I felt embarrassed, vulnerable yet lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. "Sorry," I mumbled, my voice hoarse. "Don't apologize," Dad said firmly. "You've got nothing to be sorry for." I nodded, sniffling, trying to compose myself. "Thanks, Dad." He smiled softly. "Always." The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air felt clearer, the tension dissipated. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was hiding. "Want to finish the documentary?" Dad asked after a moment, his voice light. I let out a small, shaky laugh. "Yeah, sure." He handed me the remote, and as the screen flickered back to life, a realization struck me. I wasn't alone anymore. Dad knew. He knew, and he still loved me. That was enough. The documentary resumed where we'd left off, but I wasn't truly watching. My mind replayed everything that had just transpired, every word I'd spoken, every word Dad had said in return. "You're my son, and I love you. Nothing's ever going to change that." I swallowed, my throat still raw. It felt surreal, like I was floating outside my own body, observing it all unfold. How could something I'd dreaded for so long suddenly feel better? Not fixed, not perfect, but better. I glanced at Dad. He looked calm, focused on the screen, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. I didn't know how he did it, how he remained so steady and unshaken while I felt like I was falling apart. I envied him for it. "You all right, Jake?" Dad asked suddenly, still watching the TV. I jumped slightly, my fingers tightening around the remote. "Yeah," I muttered. "I'm fine." He nodded once, seemingly satisfied with that response, and we lapsed back into silence. The documentary was nearing its conclusion, now focusing on a man who'd spent decades concealing his true self, trying to conform to societal expectations. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening as he spoke about the loneliness, the quiet desperation of pretending. Dad shifted, and I saw him glance at me from the corner of my eye. "Heavy stuff," he said quietly. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "It is." We watched in silence as the man on screen described the moment he decided he couldn't hide any longer. It wasn't a dramatic event, just a quiet realization that he couldn't continue being someone he wasn't. But then they showed other things, and I felt something twist inside me, like his words were directed at me, and a feeling of excitement from watching this with my dad. I knew what it felt like to hide, to lie to yourself and everyone else, to hope that if you ignored it long enough, it would disappear. But it didn't disappear, it just grew louder. The screen faded to black and the credits rolled. The only sounds were the low hum of the air conditioner and the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen. I set the remote down. my hands suddenly too shaky to hold it. Dad stretched, his chair creaking slightly as he leaned back. "Well," he said, exhaling deeply. That was something. "Yeah," I murmured, unsure what else to say. He looked at me, his expression softer now, almost thoughtful. "You still okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, though my chest tightened again. Dad didn't press me, he just sat there, his gaze steady. "Jake," he said after a long pause, "you know you don't have to have all the answers right now, right?" I frowned slightly, picking at the loose thread on my shorts. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's okay if you don't have everything figured out yet. You're 18, you've got time." I looked up at him, surprised. "But what if I never figure it out? What if I'm just like this forever?" Dad's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Like what?" I hesitated, my face hot, confused. Dad sighed quietly, shaking his head. "Jake, being confused doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means you're human. You're trying to figure out who you are. That's not something you need to apologize for." I swallowed, my hands fidgeting in my lap. "It doesn't feel normal." "What's normal?" Dad asked, raising an eyebrow. "Everyone's got their own version of it. But I'll tell you this. Hiding from yourself, pretending to be someone you're not, that's no way to live." I stared at him, stunned into silence. For so long I'd felt like nobody could understand what I was going through, but here he was, saying exactly what I needed to hear. I didn't know how he did it, how he always seemed to know the right thing to say, but I was grateful for it. "You're not mad?" I asked quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Dad's face softened and he shook his head. "Mad, Jake? No. I could never be mad at you for being yourself." The knot in my chest loosened a little and I felt my eyes burn again. "It's just, I don't know what I'm supposed to do," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to do anything," Dad said gently. "You just have to be honest with yourself, that's all." I nodded slowly. His words resonated deeply. I'd spent so long pretending, so long concealing my true self, that I didn't even know what being genuine with myself looked like. But sitting there with Dad, I felt like maybe, just maybe, it was possible. After a moment, Dad stood, stretching his arms overhead. "Come on," he said, nodding towards the kitchen. "Let's get something to eat. I think we could both use a break." I blinked up at him, surprised. "Now?" "Yeah," he said with a small grin. "You can't spend all day overthinking things. Trust me, it doesn't help." I couldn't help but smile a little as I followed him into the kitchen. The air felt lighter, the earlier tension beginning to dissipate. I still didn't have all the answers, but for the first time I felt like maybe I didn't need to. Dad rummaged through the refrigerator, pulling out leftovers and sandwich fixings. "Turkey okay?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "Yeah, that's fine," I replied, leaning against the counter as he started assembling the sandwiches. I watched him, still processing everything that had happened. Dad wasn't perfect. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't pretend to. But he was present. He was listening, and that was enough. "You're quiet," Dad said, looking up at me. "Just thinking," I admitted. He smiled faintly. "That's okay. Just don't forget to eat while you're at it." I chuckled softly, shaking my head as I took a plate. "Thanks, Dad." "For what?" he asked, handing me a sandwich. I hesitated, meeting his gaze. "For being here." His smile softened, and he reached out to squeeze my shoulder gently. "Always, Jake. Always." The look in his eyes hinted at something more, something I couldn't quite decipher. Not yet. But then he stood up and walked away, leaving me there, alone with my thoughts. Yet I knew this wasn't over. And the next day, the sandwiches sat untouched for a while as Dad and I lingered in the kitchen, each of us pretending to focus on something else. I took small bites, chewing slowly as if the food itself could provide a distraction. It couldn't. My mind was still preoccupied with everything we'd discussed, everything I'd revealed. I'd admitted it, or at least part of it. I'd cracked open the door I'd spent so long trying to keep locked, and the thought terrified me. Dad's reaction had been the opposite of what I'd anticipated, but I still felt raw, as if I'd peeled back a layer of skin and exposed everything underneath. And to be honest, it seemed as if he liked it or something. Earth to Jake, Dad said softly, nudging my arm. I looked up to find him watching me with that same calm, steady gaze. You're thinking too hard again. I managed a small smile. Sorry. You don't have to apologize every time you feel something, you know. Dad set his plate down and leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. It's okay to just let it sit. I frowned. What do you mean? He shrugged. You don't have to fix everything right away. Some things just take time. You figure them out as you go. I looked down at the sandwich in my hands, my appetite suddenly gone. What if I never figure it out? Then you keep going, he said simply. There's no deadline on understanding yourself. His words hung in the air. I wanted to believe him, I really did, but it still felt impossible. I'd spent so long running from this part of myself that I didn't know what it would be like to just sit with it, to allow myself to feel what I felt. Dad pushed himself off the counter and grabbed his plate, dropping it into the sink. Come on, he said, turning back to me. Let's get out of here, you need some air. I blinked at him. What? Where are we going? You'll see, he replied, already heading for the front door. 5 minutes later, we were in the car. Dad rolled down the windows as we drove, letting the warm summer air rush through the cabin. It felt good, like it was clearing my head, bit by bit. I didn't ask where we were going. I figured Dad would tell me if it mattered. We pulled into the parking lot of an old park on the edge of town. I recognized it immediately. It was the same place he used to take me when I was a kid. I'd spent hours there running through the grass, climbing on the playground, and begging Dad to push me higher on the swings. You remember this place? Dad asked as he turned off the engine and placed his hand on my leg, a bit awkwardly. Yeah, I said, a small smile playing on my lips. Haven't been here in forever. Me neither, he admitted, climbing out of the car. Thought it might be nice to come back. We walked side by side towards the old swing set, the chains creaking softly in the breeze. The park was mostly deserted, except for a couple of kids playing on the other side of the field. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. It felt peaceful in a way I hadn't anticipated. Dad stopped in front of the swings and nodded towards one of them. Well, you going to sit or what? I laughed. Seriously? Come on, he said, already lowering himself onto the swing next to it. For old time's sake. Shaking my head, I sat down and wrapped my hands around the cool metal chains. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was too big, too old for this. But then I pushed off gently with my feet, and the familiar motion took over. I swung higher and higher, the wind rushing past my face, and for a few moments, I forgot about everything. I glanced over at Dad, who was swinging too, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. He called me a big kid, and I couldn't help but laugh. His voice echoed through the deserted park. It takes one to know one, I guess. We swung in silence for a bit, the rhythmic squeak of the chains the only sound between us. I gradually slowed, letting the momentum fade until I was just sitting there, my feet scuffing the dirt. Why'd you bring me here? I asked softly, gazing across the empty field. Dad stopped swinging too, his feet firmly planted. Because this was always where you came when you needed to think. I thought it might be helpful. I looked at him surprised. You remember that? Of course I do, he said gently. You'd run around out here for hours when you were little. You wouldn't say much, but I could tell when something was bothering you. I looked away, my throat tightening. I didn't think you noticed. I notice more than you think, Jake, Dad replied. Silence fell between us again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt safe, like the air itself was making space for the things we weren't saying. I don't know what to do with all this, I finally admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Everything I'm feeling, it's so confusing. I don't know how to even talk about it. You're doing it right now, Dad said gently. I shook my head. It's not enough. I feel like I don't know who I am. Dad paused before responding. You don't have to know, not all at once. I glanced at him, my chest aching. How can you be so calm about this? I feel like I'm falling apart. Because I know you're going to be okay, he said, meeting my gaze. You don't see it yet, but you're stronger than you think. And no matter what you figure out, no matter who you are, I'm still here. His words landed in my chest like a weight, but this time it wasn't a bad feeling. It was grounding, steadying. I looked down at the dirt beneath my shoes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "Thanks, Dad," I whispered. He reached over and squeezed my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Anytime, kid." We sat there quietly as the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the park. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for years, and finally I could exhale. I didn't have all the answers. Hell, I didn't have any of the answers, but I wasn't alone. That was enough for now. "Ready to head home?" Dad asked after a while, his voice quiet. "Yeah," I said, getting up and brushing the dirt off my shorts. As we walked back to the car, I looked at Dad and gave a small smile. This was a good idea. He grinned back. "Told you, I'm the parent." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. "Sure, Dad. Whatever you say." The drive home was peaceful, the kind of comfortable silence that only happens after something important has been said. The sun had almost completely set, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. Dad rolled down the windows, letting the cool evening air flow through the car. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the breeze wash over my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt lighter. When we pulled into the driveway, Dad turned off the engine and sat for a minute, his hands on the steering wheel. I glanced over, expecting him to say something, but he just stared out the windshield, lost in thought. Eventually, he looked at me and smiled softly, then kissed me on the lips for a bit too long. "Feel any better?" he asked gently. I nodded. "Yeah, I think so." Though I wasn't sure exactly what I felt. "Good." He opened his door and I followed, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes when no one else is home. I remembered Mom would be back soon and wondered if Dad was thinking the same thing. "Want to watch something?" Dad asked, setting his keys on the kitchen counter. I hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe." He turned to me, raising an eyebrow. "You've got that look again." "What look?" I asked, feeling my cheeks flush. "The look that says you're overthinking everything," Dad said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Come on, let's put something on. Something easy this time." "Fine," I mumbled, rolling my eyes, though I was thankful for the distraction. I grabbed the remote as Dad settled onto the couch, sinking into his usual spot. I started scrolling through the options, half paying attention, when I landed on a new suggestion. It wasn't a documentary this time, more of a drama, but I recognized the actors from other movies I liked. The thumbnail was nothing special, just two guys sitting on a bench talking. "What about this one?" I asked, looking at Dad. He shrugged. "Sure, hit play." I clicked it, settling back onto the couch as the screen faded to black and the movie began. The opening scene was quiet and subdued, filled with soft music and the sound of footsteps on wet pavement. It felt different, not heavy like the documentary, but not light either. It was a story about friendship, about two guys who grew up together, neither of them really understanding themselves until they were older, and then eventually falling in love and, doing their thing. It was subtle at first, glances held a little too long, touches that lingered, but I saw it. As the movie progressed, I felt my stomach knotting up, that familiar anxiety creeping back in. I tried to concentrate on the story, the way the two characters were gradually understanding each other, but all I could think about was Dad sitting a few feet away. What was he thinking? Was this awkward for him? Did he regret watching this with me? I snuck a glance at him, my heart pounding, but he looked relaxed, completely engrossed in the film. His brow was furrowed slightly, like he was focusing on every word, every expression. It didn't seem to bother him at all. Halfway through, one of the characters finally confessed his feelings, what he'd been hiding for years. The other guy didn't respond immediately, just sat there, stunned. My chest tightened as I watched the scene unfold, like it was reaching inside me, tugging at everything I'd tried to bury. "Jake," Dad said softly, pulling me from my thoughts. I froze. "Yeah? You okay?" I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, I'm fine." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He didn't push it, though, just turned back to the screen as the movie continued. When it ended, the credits rolled in silence, soft music playing in the background. I stared at the screen, unseeing, my thoughts racing. Dad didn't move right away either, and for a moment I wondered if he was waiting for me to say something. Finally, he broke the silence. "That was good," he said simply, his voice low. "Really good." Yeah, I murmured, my voice shaky. It was. He turned to me then, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. Jake. I tensed. Yeah? You saw yourself in that, didn't you? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach dropped, and I felt my pulse spike as I stared at him, wide-eyed. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I felt frozen, like he'd pulled the rug out from under me. My voice cracked. I couldn't finish. It's cracked. Dad didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly as if he'd already known the answer. It's okay, Jake, he said gently. You don't have to say anything if you're not ready. I blinked hard, my vision blurring. Why are you saying this? I whispered, my voice trembling. Why aren't you weirded out, or mad, or something? Because I love you, Dad replied simply, his voice steady. And there's nothing wrong with you. And in that moment, the tension between us seemed to snap. He leaned in as he spoke those words and kissed me. This kiss was different, more tender and much longer. It intensified, and it felt like we'd both been yearning for this for a long time. He eventually guided me down with my head, and I complied, and honestly, it felt good. I couldn't refuse. After 10 or 15 minutes, he finished, but my emotions were so overwhelming I couldn't stop the tears. I turned away, wiping my face with the back of my hand, but it was no use. I hated crying, hated feeling so exposed, but I couldn't hold it back any longer. Dad didn't say anything. He didn't try to force me to talk or make me feel embarrassed. He just sat there, letting me cry until the sobs subsided and my breathing slowed. When I finally looked at him, his expression hadn't changed. He looked at me like he always did, like I was his son and nothing else mattered. I'm sorry, I mumbled, my voice barely a whisper. Don't apologize, he said firmly. You don't have to be sorry for who you are, Jake. Ever. I nodded slowly, the weight on my chest finally beginning to lift. Thanks, Dad. He smiled faintly, reaching over to squeeze my shoulder. You don't have to figure it all out right now, okay? You've got time. I nodded again, swallowing hard. I know. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the hum of the air conditioner and the faint music from the credits still playing on the screen. The room felt different now, lighter, clearer, like something had finally shifted between us. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I felt like I didn't have to. Dad gave my shoulder one last squeeze before standing up. Come on, he said, his voice warm. Let's clean up before your mom gets back. Yeah, I said softly, getting up to follow him. As we moved around the living room, gathering empty glasses and snack wrappers, a small smile touched my lips. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The living room felt different, like something heavy had been lifted, leaving a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. As Dad and I tidied up, the silence wasn't awkward or tense. It was the kind of quiet you feel when everything that needed to be said has finally been spoken. I picked up an empty soda can from the coffee table and glanced at Dad. He was wiping down the counter, his movements steady and unhurried. He seemed so normal, like what had happened earlier. Everything I'd admitted, everything we'd shared, hadn't changed anything between us. And maybe that was the strangest part of all. Dad? I said softly, breaking the quiet. He looked up, pausing mid-wipe. Yeah? I hesitated, my fingers fidgeting with the can. Do you ever think about what it would have been like if someone had said this stuff to you when you were my age? Dad stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set the cloth down, leaning against the counter with a, Yeah, he said finally, his voice softer now. I think about it a lot. What do you mean? I asked, stepping closer. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. When I was your age, Jake, people didn't talk about things like this. Not in my house, not anywhere, really. You were just supposed to fit in, be who everyone expected you to be. I swallowed, my chest tightening. That sounds lonely. It was, Dad admitted, his gaze distant. I spent years trying to convince myself I could bury the parts of me I didn't understand, that if I ignored them long enough, they'd go away. My throat went dry. Did they? He shook his head slowly. No, they just got quieter, but they were always there. I watched him carefully, my heart pounding. This was a side of Dad I'd never seen before, raw, unguarded. For so long I'd thought of him as this untouchable, unshakable figure, but now I saw him for who he really was. A man who had fought his own battles, carried his own burdens. Is that why you're okay with... Me? I asked softly, my voice barely audible. Dad looked up, his eyes meeting mine. I'm okay with you because you're my son. Because I love you. But yeah, maybe part of me wishes I'd had someone like this when I was younger. Someone to tell me it's okay to feel confused or scared or different. That it doesn't make you any less of a person. I blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. Thanks, Dad. He gave me a small smile, stepping forward to put a hand on my shoulder. You don't ever have to go through this alone, Jake. I'm here no matter what. I nodded, my chest tight, but no longer with that heavy ache. I know. We stood there for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the kitchen. I felt like I'd been given something precious, something I hadn't known I needed. Not just Dad's acceptance, but his understanding, his honesty. It made me feel less alone in a way I couldn't explain. After a while, Dad clapped his hands together, breaking the silence. All right, Mom's going to be home soon. Think we've got time to sneak in one last round of ice cream before she gets here? I laughed, the sound breaking through the tension like sunlight through clouds. You're unbelievable. What? He said, grinning as he opened the freezer and pulled out the half-empty tub. You can't deal with heavy stuff like this without ice cream. It's a law of the universe. I rolled my eyes, grabbing 2 spoons from the drawer. Fine, but you're doing the dishes later. Deal. We sat back on the couch with the ice cream between us, passing the tub back and forth like we used to when I was a kid. The TV was still on, though neither of us was really watching. It was just background noise now, something to fill the space. As I dug my spoon into the ice cream, I felt myself relax for the first time in a long time. I wasn't waiting for something bad to happen. I wasn't hiding or running from the truth. I was just here, sitting next to my dad, eating ice cream like everything was normal. And somehow it was. You know, Dad, he said suddenly, his tone teasing, you still owe me a rematch on the basketball court. You got lucky today. I snorted. Lucky I destroyed you. He raised an eyebrow. Keep talking, Jake. I'll show you what lucky looks like tomorrow. Sure, Dad, I said with a smirk, taking another bite of ice cream. Whatever helps you sleep at night. He laughed, shaking his head as he grabbed the tub back. You're impossible. Wonder where I got that from, I shot back, grinning. Dad just smiled. That familiar, steady look in his eyes, the same one he'd given me earlier when he said it was okay. I couldn't help but smile back. The sound of Mom's car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Dad looked up, finishing off the last bite of ice cream before standing. Showtime. Think she'll notice we ate half a tub of ice cream? Nah, he said, rinsing off the spoons. We'll plead ignorance. The front door opened and Mom's voice rang through the house. I'm back. Did you 2 eat dinner yet, or am I cooking? Had leftovers, Dad called back casually, winking at me. Welcome home. I grinned, shaking my head as I wiped the counter clean. Mom's footsteps grew closer, and I could hear her sighing as she set her bags down in the hallway. Everything okay while I was gone? She asked, peeking into the kitchen. Perfect, Dad replied easily, leaning back against the counter. Mom's eyes narrowed slightly like she didn't quite believe him. What did you 2 get up to? Guy stuff, Dad said with a shrug. I snorted, grabbing a glass of water to hide my smile. Yeah, just guy stuff. Mom rolled her eyes, muttering something about boys before disappearing toward her room to unpack. When she was gone, Dad glanced over at me, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. We good? He asked softly. I looked at him, my heart full in a way I hadn't felt before. Yeah, we're good. Good, he said, pushing himself off the counter. Now go to bed before I beat you at basketball tomorrow. Dream on, old man, I shot back, grinning as I walked past him. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I felt something settle in my chest. Something warm, steady, and unshakable. I didn't have all the answers yet, and maybe I never would, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I wasn't hiding anymore, and that was enough.